people who grew up wealthy and were spoiled. What was something you didn't realize not everyone had it? Story 1, not so much the same, but didn't realize until way later in life that the reason our neighbors' kids had dinner with us every night was because their parents couldn't afford to feed a family of 5 and keep the power on. My dad did their taxes, and it was his way of helping them without ruining their pride. We also had the parents over for barbecue almost every weekend and sent them home with all the leftovers. Didn't find out until I took a college class with one of the kids years later. Story 2 was only until later in life that I realized going out to restaurants daily isn't typical. I just figured that is how people normally ate. I thought home-cooked meals were the special ones. Story 3, for years and years when I was a kid, I would look down on people who hadn't traveled well, particularly people who did the same Disney cruises every year. In my mind, I was thinking, expand your horizons, go to Europe or China or Peru like my family does. Then I realized what a snob a dickhead I was being, and now I don't do that anymore. Story 4, some kids make more money than their parents. Even when they don't make a lot of money. My coworker and I make the same salary. She took her parents out to eat for her birthday, because to them she makes a lot of money. My parents take me out to eat for my birthday, because to them I don't make a lot of money. Story 5, I was under the assumption that all kids were shipped off to boarding school when Mom 5 moved in. Edit to those concerned with my well-being. That was a long, long time ago. I am well-adjusted and better off for it. Wife 5 turned out to be pretty cool. Boarding school was a good time. For the record, Dad is not investment banker rich. He was a surgeon. We didn't starve. Story 6, house servants. Seriously, they do all your chores and everything around the house. A friend of mine had a maid who lived with them as a full-time job and had a room in their pool house. Story 7, I thought everyone had a vacation home somewhere and had a maid who cleaned the house. I came home from college my first year and looked around my neighborhood and saw it through different eyes. Suddenly I realized how big the houses were and how most had 3-car garages. That just felt normal to me until I went to school with people who didn't have those things. Story 8, on the receiving end of this. Some kid once bragged to me about how he has a pool table in his basement, and then he asked if I had a pool table. Thinking he meant something like the table my parents kept near my inflatable pool, I told him, of course, I have a pool table. Story 9, my family was never overly wealthy, but my parents provided an abundance of toys for me and my sister. I had a huge imagination, and I played with every single one of them. But I would be flabbergasted when I went to my friends' houses to see that they didn't have as many toys, or any toys at all. I used to think that some kids just didn't like toys. Story 10, a private jet. We would always charter a private jet when flying for vacations or to visit relatives in other states. I would see all the other jets at the airport, but just assume that they were just much bigger private jets. I would actually be pretty jealous, as I would imagine my family flying in such a large plane and having all that room. Turns out those were commercial flights with very little room at all. I was 15 when I finally realized this. Story 11, pretty middle class, but live in an expansive suburb with almost 0 apartment complexes. Always just assumed everyone had a house and didn't really understand the concept of renting a house or an apartment until I was 13 to 14 when I heard them talking about it on Friends or something. Story 12, I am on the opposite end of the spectrum. I grew up poor, and my mom cleaned houses for rich people. Most of the time she would babysit and clean, so she would bring me along as well, because most of the kids were my age anyway. They would ask me questions like, if your mommy cleans our house, then who cleans your house? And what do you mean you've never been to Disneyland? We go 4 times a summer. As a kid, I didn't really think anything of it, but looking back, I realized what a huge gap there was in lifestyles. Story 13, when I was in high school, I asked my parents what APR was in those car commercials. It blew my mind that people couldn't pay for a car in full. Looking back, yeah, I was pretty sheltered. Story 14, the ability to hang out on a yacht out in the middle of the ocean on a beautiful day, playing checkers with your grandpa. Edit, holy, I didn't think this would get upvoted that much. I will ask my uncles and find out what type of boat my grandfather had. Story 15, when I was 13, I brought over a friend who was really impressed by my parents' automatic garage door opener. That was a huge shift in perspective for me. Story 16, not the rich one. In fact, I grew up dirt poor. However, 2 of my best friends grew up pretty affluent. One had thrifty parents who invested and saved. The other is the son of a literal rocket scientist and a Boeing engineer. The latter is actually pretty grounded. He tells stories and kind of laughs about stuff like, hey, I had a nanny throughout my childhood, and I didn't realize until I grew up that was a rich person thing. The former just seems dumbfounded that I found the will to live. He's been to almost every continent. He's never had a worry for money, has never had a car payment, and seems bewildered by how much things are capable of costing. The fact that I can't even afford health insurance and my car payment in the same month mystifies him. And why wouldn't it? His mom gave him $2,000 for a couch out of the blue, And I don't even have that amount of money to drop on my medical bills. They're good people, though. They spend a lot of time trying to help me catch up, and whether they know it or not are the only reason I still have a roof over my head some months. I try to pay them back the best I can, but they're pretty keen on telling me that I don't have to buy their friendship. They know I have a heart. They just want to help. Story 17. Early on in our relationship, my empathetic, socially aware, and compassionate wife said offhand, "Well, but you must have had some silver growing up, right? I mean, everyone has some silver." Story 18. My husband's family was loaded from the time he was 4 till he was 16. His sister had horses. Her cheapest horse cost my in-laws $16,000 to buy. My SGL also competed in hunter jumpers from the age of 5 to 18. She also competed in ice skating and had a full wardrobe. FYI, those ice skating dresses are expensive AF. My husband's family also went on vacations constantly. They had tons of toys, dirt bikes, jet skis, cars, trucks, an airplane. They also put a pool inside their 4,000 square feet house. They had a maid and a gardener. They also went to private school with a bunch of other rich-ass hats. My SGL thought that all people live their life, or at least they did if their parents loved them. My husband thought it was the norm. It was hard on my in-laws. When they lost their business, it caught on fire. My husband, who was 16, learned how to adapt. Kind of seriously, he doesn't know how to dust my SGL, who was 18 at the time. Still thinks she is a ritual thing. She is 30 now and spends money like it is on fire. She doesn't cook, clean, or do any manual labor. I pity whoever is dumb enough to commit to her. Story 19. Not me. I grew up semi-poor, but it's about a certain in-law. My in-law grew up different than his siblings. His parents came into high income right when he was a teenager, so he had a different upbringing than them. He was able to live with his parents until he was 27 and could have kept going in a luxurious high-rise condo that had a 600-month HOA, rent-free. His father taught him how to do similar work as him. He got his bachelor's degree over the course of 5 to 6 years, while working retail from 18 till 24. His father then used inside connections to help him get a job at a nice cloud IT services company in the area. He then consistently relied upon his father's expertise to ask for advice or learn HWO to do things. Seemingly a genius to his supervisors and the president of the company, he was carried and lifted through all of this. He then gets another job and finally can move away from the roost. He's been out of college 4 years now and is making $148K a year at 31 years old. I had a conversation with him about the homeless and how they had a different life growing up, and that makes it harder. Fuck that. That's bullshit. It's all in your mind. You have to believe you can succeed, and you will. I tell him about how if everyone had equal circumstances, brain chemistry, life experiences, opportunity, sure, then it would be solely up to merit and effort. But that's not how it works. Give him some anecdotes to compare. I just don't know why all these bums don't just get a job, though. They're lazy. That's why they are at the bottom of society. I was really upset by this point. My jaw visibly dropped because his assertion that homeless people were just lazy when he lounged around getting just in bachelors and was totally propped up in his career that he now has. And he completely lacked any recognition of all the help he had. He thinks he did it all himself, and that all those homeless people had the same opportunity he did. Other than politics, he's a really nice guy. But this topic is just so deeply disturbing to me that he can't see his own privilege whatsoever that I have to not bring it up anymore. Story 20. Extracurriculars. My parents put me through so many classes. I just thought it was a normal thing that everyone did, although not necessarily as many as I did. When I moved out and discovered that I had a budget to be able to afford to replace my violin strings and bow hairs, it hit me that my parents must have been spending an actual fortune on me. On top of the actual classes, of which there were many, and getting there, they were buying equipment, my instruments and music books, maintaining, upgrading, replacing as necessary, paying for me to take music exams, paying for me to travel with my youth music group. I think a year of my extracurriculars in high school must have cost at least as much as a year of an undergrad degree in Canada. Holy, I owe my parents so much money if I ever get rich. Story 21. I used to be spoiled as I was from a wealthy family, but my dad grew up on a farm and raised is the same way. So while I was spoiled, I also had a pretty good understanding of that. My cousin, on the other hand, had her mind blown when she went to college and found out that not everyone has a maid. And not everyone grew up in a relatively crime-free environment. And not everyone could go to Disneyland every year. TBH, I was a little embarrassed when I heard about this because my family didn't even do those things and we grew up in the same town. Story 22. I didn't grow up rich, but simply financially stable. My boyfriend of many years' mom and 10-year-old twin sisters came over to my house so they could swim in my pool. They were so excited because they got to go swimming. Also, their mom couldn't leave the poolside because they basically didn't know how to swim. I was literally shocked. My mom did swim lessons with me starting at like 4, and I did summer swim team all through elementary school. We swam almost every summer day. It occurred to me that because they have never had access to a pool, they never learned how to swim, TLDR knowledge of how to swim. Story 23, this is going to sound silly, but money like spare cash, I didn't realize until I went to college that everyone doesn't have extra spending money to spend on silly things like movies or a non-cafeteria lunch. Story 24, I grew up in a rich U.S. suburb. What did I not realize they didn't have? A school system with highly qualified teachers. Nearly endless community support tax levies passed to keep things like music rather than cut everything. None of the tattered textbooks or battered laptops we're seeing in the U.S. now. And this was a public school system. But the super rich around it realized its value, were willing to pay for it, and don't bat an eye when the district's financial transparency report shows a bunch of six-figure teachers. Not overpaid gym teachers by virtue of tenure either. At least one high school science teacher had a friggin' PhD, but most of us didn't know unless someone told us. Story 25, this is so depressing. I'm struggling to come up with a down payment for a $60K trailer on less than an acre property in buttfuck nowhere northern Michigan. One guy here spent $50K on a flight home. Story 26, growing up, my family was considered by the government to be below the poverty line. My siblings and I qualified for free school lunches. But we live in a safe part of town. We would often put a fan in the window to bring in cool air on summer nights. One evening, I was giving a ride to some teenagers from church to another youth leader's house who lived in a similar neighborhood to mine. One of the youth commented, "This is one of those neighborhoods where people don't lock their windows at night." I was in my early 20s at the time. I was ashamed that I never realized leaving my window open to enjoy a cool summer breeze at night was something people a couple miles away from me couldn't do. Story 27, I guess I didn't know not everyone has a pet platypus. I thought it was common. But no one at school had one, and they all laughed when I asked about it. Story 28, what blew my mind was when I learned about layaway. That was my first real heartbreak. That people literally were working each week to buy their kid the toy they wanted. You want to know about sacrifice? Layaway is the ultimate. Story 29, my parents called me spoiled and were always chastising me because I didn't have regular chores. Not that I didn't do chores, but that I didn't adhere to a set schedule. Also, I didn't get allowance for this or anything, so I guess I didn't realize that other kids had to strictly obey their chores list, even though from what I heard they were getting allowance. Story 30, I've never been the atypical female in a fashion. I work a job right now that isn't the best pay simply because there's not a dress code. Can wear jeans to work. When my best friend and I were making our communions, you had to wear a dress. I did not care. I did not want to go dress shopping. Ended up, my mom just went and picked one out for me. My BFF? Now she really got into it. Her mom went to all kinds of stores, tried on all kinds of dresses. She goes on to tell me that they found one, but it was pretty expensive, so she probably would get something else. The day gets closer, and my friend goes on to tell me how her fam had saved up so she could have her fancy dress. Hooray for Lisa. Oh, how she went on. Showed it off to me. Her mom are so super proud. What are you wearing, they ask. I don't know. My mom picked me up some rags she's making me wear. UGH, nothing special. Day arrives. We all show up to the church. Yet her expensive dress that her family had saved a month for was the exact same raggy thing my mom had bought for me as a throwaway, where once tossed, light bulb went off in my head that day. Things I took for granted like vacations, new cars, shopping for new school cloths every year. That's not how everyone lived. Real eye-opener. Story 31, I was hanging out with two of my friends around Christmas time this last year, and we decided to go to the mall to shop around. While we were walking around, one friend turns to my other friend and I and says, "Oh, my God, I almost forgot. That would have been terrible. I'm so glad I remembered that. I have to get present for my nannies." "What did you guys get your nannies?" She was dead serious, so I tried my hardest not to burst out laughing. But that was probably the funniest moment of our friendship thus far. The day she learned that we don't all have nannies, she is 7, that do literally everything for us. Story 32, I wouldn't say. I was rich, and my parents try not to spoil me. I got my mom's old van when I turned 16, live in a nice suburban community, 4-bedroom, 5-bath, with a yard and a picket fence, where my parents' income was pretty average for the community, and we went on big vacations every year. Disney World, a cruise, Mackinac, ski trips. So I was well off. Both my parents had the same job my entire life. My mom owns a successful veterinary practice, and my dad works a middle-class job at a loading dock with full benefits. I guess what surprised me is just the lack of stability some people have. People talk about parents switching jobs a lot, having to move because of jobs, or because they rented, parents being on drugs, or people just not having respect for their parents or not liking them with good reason. My childhood seems so average, but I was probably top 20 or so. I never would have thought how hard it was for some people growing up. Edit in top 10, still realizing. Story 33. I didn't grow up financially wealthy, but I grew up in a wealthy upbringing in the sense that I had the most loving and selfless supporting cast in my life. My parents offer me everything I can imagine, and they set my standard for parenting so high that I was sad to learn that not every person is blessed enough to grow up with such an asset. Story 34. Apparently, when I was in kindergarten, I asked my friends, "So, what color is your family's airplane?" I guess I just thought they were like cars at it. This got a lot more attention than I expected it to. I'm done explaining my life. Y'all have a good night, LOL. Story 35. I teach teens whose father makes millions a year. They were very upset that a doctor only makes $200K a year, and they weren't sure that was enough to live comfortably on. We did the math one day and realized he makes more in a day than a minimum wage earner does in a year. To be fair, it's pretty hard to understand how money works when everything is done for you. Most of the kids I've taught have no concept of income and cost of living. Parents, teach your kids how to pay for things and what life costs. Story 36. On the other side of the spectrum here, I used to go to a private girls' school, very lucky to even go there in the first place. My mom and grandparents both put money in so I could go there and were late on their payments sometimes. My mom worked 2-3 jobs, and my grandparents took money out of their savings. A girl once made fun of me because I had secondhand clothes. We then had a school charity breakfast, and she met my family and saw how they obviously were from humble beginnings. A lot of families were decked out in designer clothing, and my family wasn't. She apologized later and said that she didn't realize that families could be so close and happy. That made me feel sad for her. Story 37. I really hate these people who grew up, poor people who grew up wealthy questions, because there are so many assumptions already being made here. The fact is, you can be spoiled regardless of where you came from. All you need is a shitty set of adults, and you have the recipe for spoiled and entitled children. The assumption is usually growing up poor street smart, how to grow up fast, and rich live in a bubble, and they think the world is roses. I've met plenty of people who grew up poor, yet were not very street smart, who were very naive and entitled. And I've met some pretty down-to-earth people who grew up well off, and many in between. Story 38. Overnight camp summer programs. Where I grew up, we all went to overnight camp for the summer once we were about 10 years old. And in high school, I did various travel programs, 30 days in the Western U.S. one summer, 21 days to Australia the next. Story 39. I had a roommate once. His father was a multimillionaire. Anyway, so I was sitting at the table paying my bills. He asked what I was doing, and upon mentioning I was making a car payment, his mind was blown away. The idea of financing a car was very foreign to him. He asked so many questions, and he could just not understand why anyone would do that. When we got to the topic of car insurance, that was another thing he could not get. He always paid cash for vehicles, and he was self-insured. Everyone in his family and all his friends did this. I felt oh so very small. Story 40. A few things. 1. Didn't realize most moms didn't have the choice of staying home with their kids. That's just how myself and most of my friends grew up. 2. Having people for your lawn and landscaping was a luxury. 3. Traveling, even something like in another state, isn't an option for a lot of people. 4. I assumed getting a car when you got your license was just a thing that parents did for their kids. I've gotten better, because I left my bubble, but sometimes I think back on things and cringe at the fact of how naive I was. None can stand against Sun Wukong. Story 41. Vacation in exotic locations or foreign locations. It was the first time I went to the Philippines, Prague to go back 3 times. Went to Vegas 5 times before I was 16, Disneyland twice, Disney World once. At 15, I had already been to most of the Baltic countries, been to the Louvre, Hermitage, and British National Museum. At 17, I was in Egypt, Greece, Turkey, and Italy. When I was 18, I stayed at the Waldorf. 20, I did my first backpacking trip in Asia, followed by 3 years of 1 to 3 month backpacking trips to Asia. Most I had in my bank at any time was like $2K, and my parents paid for everything. Story 42. That credit is a way of survival for a lot of people. That most people look at the price of things and have decided either, or they don't just look for whatever they like. That people pretend to be nice to you because you have money, but low-key would like to slap the out of you. Story 43. I wasn't exactly spoiled. We were required to get jobs as soon as we could. We all drove shitty cars, etc. But I did grow up in a fairly well-off family. The main thing that was a major slap in the face when I realized not everyone had it was simply plenty of food. Our pantry and fridge was always well-stocked with pretty much anything we wanted or needed. And when I found out in high school, I moved in the 9th grade and went to a giant school in the city that some people didn't know where their next meal was coming from. It nearly broke me. Story 44. I always thought my family was less well off than we actually were. My friends vacationed in Europe and the Caribbean. My family drove to a cabin on a lake for a week every year. My friend parents had nice new cars. My parents drove used cars. I never was without something I needed or even desperately wanted, but I was regularly told that things were too expensive. We bought store brand items, not name brand. Then I went to college. My parents have been saving tons of money and put 3 kids through college, and I graduated debt-free. I also had enough money for a down payment on a house as a wedding fund that had been saved by my parents. All 3 of us got that. My father passed away, and my brother, master's in finance, went through my mother's finances and announced she was in great shape, could retire whenever she wanted, and could pay off the mortgage if she wanted to. Turns out my parents made much better money than they spent. They just kicked at saving and gave all of us great nest eggs. Story 45, that there were nationality Americans. I grew up in a WASP town, went to a WASPy prep school, and never heard anyone ever describe himself as an English American. It wasn't until high school when I realized that people not only identify as Italian-Irish-Mexican American, but derive a lot of their identity from it. Story 46, my mom makes quite a good living for herself, but I never felt richer than my friends. I went to public school and had a job throughout high school and stuff like that. We live in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, but no one ever really mentioned it as abnormal. In retrospect, my parents worked really hard to make me humble. Anyway, it wasn't until my senior year when my best friends and I were all applying for colleges. We had all gotten into our first choice, and when one of my friends said she wasn't going, I literally had no idea why she wouldn't go. She kind of looked at me blankly and said it was because they just couldn't afford it. I was going to school with the same tuition as hers, and there was never a doubt that my parents would be able to cover me. It made me realize, for one, how incredibly lucky I was to go through college and come out with no debt, but also how unaffordable higher education is to the average person. Story 47, a dad who hasn't split, but is never around. My dad did lots of business trips to Japan, China, Germany, Switzerland, the UK. When he wasn't gone, he was working way too much. Most days he was at home. He was on business calls for at least half the days that I learned very quickly not to interrupt. I love the man. He's a good man, but I didn't exactly have a lot of father-son moments as a kid. We lived in a pretty rural area as well. I think being alone that much kind of screwed me up. Story 48, we were well off middle class, and I wasn't really spoiled as a child, but the one thing that sticks out to me is yard maintenance. Growing up, my parents had a landscaping company handle everything year-round. It's not that I was spoiled and never had to mow the lawn. We simply never had a lawnmower. When I bought my house at 25 and moved out, I was blown away by the effort required to properly maintain a yard, not to mention the insane upfront cost of getting everything I needed. My shed now has a lawnmower, 2 leaf blowers, a snow blower, a weed whacker, a wheelbarrow, gutter cleaning tools, rakes, shovels, and a power washer. I bought more equipment in the first 6 months of owning my home than my parents did for the entirety of my upbringing. Story 49, my family has a private white sand beach on Cape Cod, with showering facilities, a wooden deck next to the shore in case you don't want to get sandy, and just a brief walk up to the house. I was in my teens before I realized that not everyone had access to such a pristine and beautiful location whenever they like. I have only been to a public town beach maybe 5 times, and just to accompany friends. I am a very lucky person, I know. Story 50, my grandmother would tip everyone 20, including doormen, delivery people, and cabbies. This was in 1971, when 20 was like 100. I always wondered why people thanked her so much. I was a little kid and did not realize the value of her tips. Story 51, poor person here, recently aghast by a family 1 degree of separation from me who has, on more than one occasion, ordered delivery only to change their minds on the type of food they wanted and throwing out the untouched, unwanted delivery. Just awful. It's difficult to put into words how much I hate this behavior. So much unmet need. So much freshwater loss. Story 52, my mom's side of the family wasn't particularly wealthy, but they were all musically inclined, and every one of them had a piano in their house, either an upright or a baby grand. I grew up thinking they were common pieces of furniture like a couch. The first time I went to spend the night at a friend's house, I was like, where's your piano? Story 53, having full-time maids. I am not a white American. One of the girls I dated was. When I moved into my first proper house, I casually mentioned how I got the wrong size bed sheets, because I've never had to make my own bed care about what's the size of the bed, and she soon broke up with me claiming I had too much privilege, even though having full-time help around the house isn't a big deal where I am from. Story 54, both of my parents grew up incredibly poor and worked hard to be considered upper middle class. I was 10 when they started taking in other kids. They always told my 2 other siblings and I, we have extra bedrooms, and these kids have no room. I thought it was normal to make sure every bedroom was occupied. It was years later that I realized my parents purposely purchased a home with extra bedrooms, so they could provide a home environment they wish they had for kids that had struggles. 20 years later, and 12 of the 14 kids that live with my parents are still actively involved in our lives. Our holidays are awesome. Story 55, we weren't wealthy, by any means. 50K or so total income household for 5 people, and dad paid child support. But my mom and stepdad worked really hard to give my brothers and I a good life. We didn't live in the best of areas, and some of my friends were dirt poor. One thing I noticed was everyone always wanted to hang out at our house. Because we had a lot of snacks and sodas, we would make the 45 or so minute drive to Costco to buy in bulk. Some nights after 12 to 16-hour shifts, my mom or stepdad would finish cooking, notice more kids had shown up, and just throw a few more burgers on the grill or boil more pasta. If work ran long, they'd somehow have food waiting for us or money for pizza. They sometimes complained about the cabinets always emptying out quick, but I knew they secretly loved keeping us all fed and happy. All you kids must have hollow legs with how much you eat. Story 56, I'm not exactly rich or spoiled, but I grew up in the States. I live in Korea now, and it's strange when I realize people here didn't celebrate Christmas the way we did. They enjoy Christmas a little. Some of our holidays, like Easter, don't quite make it mainstream over here. So, someone who didn't hunt for Easter eggs, they don't know what Fritos corn chips are, little things like that. Story 57, parents who were perfect for each other. My parents are always on the same page. I have never seen them argue, and it's rare to even see them disagree. I was very surprised to learn that not all marriages were as great as my parents'. I probably realized this around 11 when I saw my friends' parents get into a heated fight with each other. I know this doesn't really have to do with wealth, but it did make me feel spoiled. Story 58, not amazingly wealthy, but definitely spoiled compared to most. I used to think most of England was detached houses with gardens and parks everywhere like where I grew up. I knew terrace houses and flats existed, but assumed they were only in deprived areas or for temporary accommodation or something. I also thought children sharing bedrooms must have been because the kids really got on and wanted to, and thought it was weird they wouldn't want their own privacy, same with sharing toys. I also remember not understanding why one of my friends had to wait to use the bathroom in his house, grew up with 5 bathrooms in a house with 4 people, or why he was surprised we have a larder. Thankfully, I have a lot more perspective these days. I also really want to clarify that I was a kid and never looked down on people. It was more sheltered ignorance. Typing this makes me feel pretty awkward, to be honest. Story 59, I'm afraid my kid is turning out to be spoiled. I'm paying for her college in its entirety when she wanted to apply to 5 different schools, and I told her to use her credit card to pay for it without mentioning that I'd pay it off. She gave me a very entitled attitude and asked why she had to pay for them. I'm giving her a car that we've had in storage for 4 years while we were stationed overseas, and she is mad that she is expected to pay for her own insurance and registration. I tried talking to my wife about it, but we both feel like no matter what we do, it's never enough for her. I feel like I'm setting some boy somewhere up for some high-maintenance princess. Story 60, had a friend drunkenly ask why I don't fire my maid and why I'd allow my maid to be so lazy. Just stared at him while he went on and on about why the maid didn't do my dishes. It never registered to them. Not everyone has a maid. Story 61, I grew up watching my mother and sister buy horses and exotic birds. Guess who had to muck the stalls and feed the birds? They wore new clothes and drove new cars. I had a caddy and work at a car wash to buy my own thrift shop clothes and a very used car. When they had people over, they would lock me in my bedroom, and I wouldn't get food or bathroom use. I saw the rich life my family led while I was poor. Everyone thought I was well off. I wasn't. My family was. Story 62, I was extremely spoiled growing up, but understood the concept of poor and poverty. Thanks to the media and friendships I had with people, I remember getting irritated, though, if someone barely had food in the pantry, or if they kept the temperature at an uncomfortable level to save money. Story 63, the first time I flew on a public plane, I was really excited. Usually we would fly everywhere on a private plane. I was very young and remember being upset that we never flew on those big planes. It seemed much more exciting to me. Only now do I realize how incredibly spoiled I was. Story 64, very middle class, however didn't pay a dime for college. I keep forgetting that is not the case for a lot of my friends. I was always confused as to why some of my friends were struggling financially even though they were making 30K on the low end. Makes more sense now. Story 65, I didn't grow up living mega wealthy, but my parents are one heirs. We just save a lot of money and have some high living expenses, so there isn't a massive fortune left over to have fun with, but I was always comfortable, and it was rare that I desperately wanted for anything. I realized later in life how rare flying was for most people. I had flown upwards of 30 times by the time I left high school, all over the country, and that's a conservative estimate TBH now. In college, I'm the only one of my friends who has flown more than a small handful of times in their life, and a huge number of people I know have never flown at all. I just thought that flying to Colorado or Montana for a skiing trip, or California for the beach, or DC for a spontaneous spring break trip was a bit of a treat at most.